Hey everybody, and welcome to Module 2. We are going to go ahead and share my screen. I know you guys have already worked through some of those sociology lectures when it comes to theory, and the reason I kind of went with those as opposed to making new ones through the aging process like they did in Chapter 2 is that I really wanted you to get a groundwork for the theory by itself so that way as we continue to apply it to other topics you have a more sense of how to do that as opposed to maybe applying it strictly to age and aging and that kind of dynamic. I wanted to make sure that you had those two separate from each other, and so we're going to go over a few things from aging that were topics throughout the chapter in theory as we moved through it. And so let's go ahead and get started. And I will go ahead and stop after I get done with chapter 2, and then we'll get into chapter 10, and then we'll get into the text, the Kafer text, Feminist Queer Crip. And that book has multiple chapters. There's several really, really good chapters in there. So if you are interested in any of the rest of that book, because she is a really brilliant writer and she's witty and she's sassy and she's kind of entertaining to read. And I know that there's a section in there on environmental policy, essentially. So it talks about a lot about how national parks and recreation centers deal with accessibility for disabled persons and or how they don't. So I know that that chapter is really interesting. And then there's a couple of other chapters in there, one about advertising and disabled persons or persons with disability. And so there's a lot of different functions to that book. And she doesn't just talk about medical, but that was the particular chapter that I wanted to make sure got read because I think it's most pertinent to the topics we're going to talk about. All right, so let's go ahead and start here. So these are kind of overall what we're going to talk about, right? And we're going to talk about all these different things within the functions of kind of how they set it up in the book, but we're going to do it a little quicker because I'm not going to go over the theory in this particular lecture. So when they talked about functionalism and really how things move as like a system or even like the organs in a body, right? They talked about it in reference to nursing homes and how they function as part of society due to a need of an elderly population that doesn't necessarily have the same care work available as maybe they did in other generations. So in other generations you're going to be looking at much less elderly people because they didn't make it to that age, and that was due to medical intervention and technology. But also you saw a lot of the care work being done by the women in the household, and so if there was a woman that was able to be home, that person could care for the elderly in the family as well. And or if they had care workers in the home that were women outside of their particular home that came in and did the domestic labor, those people also took care of the elderly as well as the young persons. And so we saw a lot of that shift as women of all backgrounds really needed to be working, and you saw a lot of more need for a 2-income household or a 2+ income household, depending on the social dynamics in which you operate. And because of that, we left this space in history and we started this a lot of a population growing past that point where they would be working. And B, you saw a lot of that population needing care work that wasn't there anymore. And so that became this need in society. And what the book is talking about is that functional way to make that work, or dysfunction in some ways, is to create care facilities or nursing homes. And what ended up resulting is that you ended up having a lot of people in nursing homes that were severely ill, those without family, those who were disabled in some way, and or those who were extremely ill and could no longer be cared for in the household, by say maybe even past the point of maybe having hospice or what have you there. And essentially what that created was this need for nursing homes. However, it did not actually function for everybody. It was functioning for the people who could afford it, and or depending on what you could afford, was allotted you a specific type of nursing home, or nursing homes that were more likely to have maybe some dysfunctions or not have some dysfunctions. And we'll get into that in a second. But mostly this was people also 85 and older. So that demographic that we were seeing switch from like that 65 where retirement was to 85 is not as represented in these nursing homes. And that was something that was kind of important because it was talking essentially about the fact that there was this, and we'll get into that when we talk about symbols, but there's this representation of nursing homes being um, these like way older people as opposed to maybe those who we just consider old as a society, which might hit that retirement age and plus. And we're also seeing a lot more able-bodied people in their 80s and 90s, and we're getting into that era where we're seeing a lot more over 100, and depending on medical advancements and medical technology, we might end up seeing more and more of that, or life expectancy continue to go up depending on that. All right. So on the flip side of seeing that as a function of fitting a need, right? Nursing home were fitting that need in society or fulfilling the function that was this gap of care work for those who are elderly and in need of that. It also represented some dysfunctions. And what was happening was those places have very much been stigmatized and or also represent these dysfunction of being not really pleasant places, definitely not being hygienic. They talked about in the book maybe smelling of urine or smelling of any kind of bodily fluids just because of the fact that they were in there. They intend to be very lonely. They tend to have dehumanization and a lack of privacy as part of it. And that's just because they're shoving so many people into these group networks and doing so in a way that doesn't necessarily allow for, group activity or sustainable living, because you're seeing a lot more of this or surrounding severely ill or disabled persons. You're going to see a lot less autonomy given to that person, and that's going to create a dehumanizing factor for those people that are in there. There's also a good amount of neglect, that is primary amounts of abuse and verbal abuse, which the books talks about as not as bad as abuse. And I want to make sure that we're not ranking any kind of trauma. While physical and sexual trauma leave specific kinds of marks on humans, so does neglect and medical trauma, depending on if they're drugging these elderly people or not, and or verbal and emotional abuse, especially in those who may have Alzheimer's or may have memory loss or may have any kind of other things going on with the brain that can impact the ability to possibly process or maybe even do the trauma work they need to do to be able to survive those settings. And again, it's not to say that every nursing home is this way, but it is typically the higher the higher the quality, the more the cost, and the more the cost, the less likely those people who are severely ill or without family or disabled are going to be able to afford. So as a reminder, you're going to see a lot of nursing homes that have these particular abuses and neglects be those who are in already marginalized populations. So you're going to see this more in those who are impoverished to begin with. You're going to see those more who are going to be disabled or living off of some kind of disability. You're going to see those more in those who have severe medical bills or illnesses that have caused that. You're going to see those more in your persons of color. You're going to see those more in your queer communities. And it's also interesting, side note, when we talk about hygienics and dysfunctions, we also talk about those who are aging in an asexual or non-sexual way. However, the highest rate of spread of infectious diseases, especially sexually transmitted infectious diseases, does come in our elderly populations. And that's mostly because as these people are limited on what they can and cannot do, and their human contact is thought to be non-sexual in nature, they tend to be not given resources and or communicated with about particular kinds of transmission of diseases that is going to happen within sexual contact. So you're also seeing a lot of that as we move forward. And since we're talking about health, that is something that is going to be a dysfunction of nursing homes that is going to have to be a conversation as we move forward with our aging population, which is growing. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about conflict, social conflict, and social security. So really what social conflict theory is about is really this it in its totality, it is there is a finite amount of resources, and those resources are in control by certain groups, and certain groups don't have as much, right? And that could be economic, that could be social networking, that could be um, the ability to get jobs, that could be a wide variety of things, right? But overall, it boils down to, hey, there's a finite amount of resources of any kind, and we live in a hierarchical society. So some people get those resources and have better access to them and better opportunities to get those, and some people don't, right? And that's depending on a multitude of variables, right? Including multiple of your identity factors. So race, gender, sexuality, um, age, and that's the one we're kind of getting at here, and ability. Okay. And so really what we set up is this industrialization period, especially following the world wars, when we were doing a lot of mass production for countries like Europe and things of that nature, produced a massive amount of jobs that soldiers came home and did when they came back from war. But what it also did was create a place where most of the work became tedious or became manual labor. And what you were seeing was the people over 65 or 65 plus getting fired from these jobs because there were able-bodied and or younger bodied persons who were now coming back and had an abundance of need for financial security. And so in doing that, the businesses realized that there was this massive amount of essentially worker pool that they could pull from and not need to hire those 65 plus. And so they were really struggling to get jobs. On top of that, you were having a lot of difference in the ability for who could further advance in their careers, right? So the GI Bills allowed a lot of people to go to school, a lot of people to find secondary careers post military deployment, things of this nature. But what the opportunities for those who were over 65 to really learn the new technology, to really advance their careers by learning new skills was really limited. Um, and because that industrialization process or that manufacturing process was changing, so were a lot of those skilled, so were it was taking away a lot of those jobs for those like skilled laborers in the way of maybe like specific kinds of shoemakers or specific kinds of um, clothes manufacture, like this mass production of products was taking away those more tailored jobs, those more very crafty centered work that was up until that point very much centered around individuals who were teaching other individuals how to do this craft. And that craft, because that was things that were necessary in society, people would come to them for their business. But once it was started being manufactured on these large scale very quick ways, and companies were really mass producing things in big ways, it really changed the dynamics of how the economy worked and who was going to work those jobs. And so this created a situation where essentially if you were 65 or older and you were out of work and or you were getting ready to be out of work, you were really going to struggle to make ends meet. The economy was thriving at that point because there were so many people coming back and because most of Europe was under had some kind of parts of it destroyed in big ways, and they were rebuilding by using all of these things that the US was manufacturing. The economy itself was really doing well. Thus, those that were younger were able to spend money, and thus that creates a dynamic where if you can't spend money and you can't keep up with those who are spending money, then you're going to start slipping through the cracks. right? And that's what was really happening. Um, and so what those people realized though, as and what Townsend really talked about is that he would get groups of people together, and they were called Townsend clubs. And essentially, they were petitioning for the government at both local, state, and also a federal level to really work towards some kind of like past retirement or past this point where really it's able to find work, a way to still have an income coming in. And so this is really where we started to talk about Social Security. Because up until that point, really generational wealth and or you worked until you were gone, was really the way of the US. And so really this point was starting to kind of get at that. And what they realized was because there was a growing number of those 65 and older, they had a good amount of political pull. Also, they had time on their hands. So, because they weren't working and they couldn't get these jobs, they had the ability to have time and numbers to create that political power. And that's something that matters, right? That ends up being a demographic you don't want to lose come the next voting cycle. And that's still the case, right? Those 65 and older still remain fairly politically active as those generations goes. And that's usually due to the amount of time you can give into political activism or into what is around you, in the way of politics. And that political power also formed into not only these thousand clubs, but it remains that way. So you have this group called the Gray Panthers, which they ended up talking about a little bit in the towards the end of the chapter. And it's really talking about this group founded by a couple of 65 plus women who really wanted to make change, and they were inspired by how the Black Panther Party really had a desire to create its own political party. And that sparked some imagination within these people's brains as well, why can't we do this too? We have different needs. They aren't being met. How do we get our needs met? And how do we draw attention to these needs? And what ended up happening was a lot of push got pushed. And they have created a lot of momentum on a number of things and a number of social issues. However, it didn't quite become as broad and as sweeping as they wanted to. Partly likely because those 65 plus and older house a number and a wide variety of identities that have a wide variety of needs. And so those needs might not have all been in the same place, right? And that happens with any kind of social movement, right? You're going to have needs different depending on the other intersections of identity, right? And we'll get into that more when we start talking about activism. But the Townsend clubs ended up actually getting their goals, right? Their goal was very much Social Security. Now, the Social Security that they did get was a much less version of what they were asking for. However, it is, and it's been shortened and it's been condensed since then. And it's been chipped away at, and then it's been put more into a medical, depending on that, because medical prices have gone up. And so it's been shimmied, and how it is navigated has changed over the years and over the generations. But what I love about these groups is that just because they got that push through, there was still going to be a gap, a large gap in years, like 60s to the like mid 70s, before they were going to start paying out those things. And people were in crisis at that point. And they continued their political pressure, they continued their activism, and actually got that to happen years before it was intended, right? So 50s and 60s, I said. That's not what I meant. They started in the 30s, and it wasn't supposed to start till I think 45. But they actually got it in 1940. So that's a big deal. That is a large amount of political power. And the main reason for this was that collide of the Depression, plus all of those manufacturing jobs switching, plus the world wars, all of these things combined into this like big ball of for those 65 and older. But again, talking about power dynamics, you're also going to see, and I think they talked about this a little bit in conflict theory, but an overwhelming majority of those who represent us in the House and Senate are those 65 plus. That is the demographic that is primarily, and the demographic is not just 65 plus, but it's 65 plus white men. That's the demographic that is massively overrepresented in our political process compared to the demographics of our society or of our country as a whole, right? And that's something that creates political power. It also creates power dynamics. Now, I'm not going to say that those individuals have the same needs, wants, desires as those maybe 65 plus as a whole. And I say that because those sitting in those congressional seats have a budget and retirement plan and level of economic prosperity and opportunity that most 65 plus and older couldn't even fathom. Okay. So they're going to think that 65 and older needs and the way we need to handle Social Security is going to be probably very different than those 65 at and plus as a whole in this country. And so that is something that you need to think about, how those power dynamics play out. And then there's also competition over resources, right? That's the whole big point of social conflict theory. Just getting back to that. All right. So what does it mean to be old? And this is where we started talking about the symbolic interactionist theories. We started talking about how language and symbols really impact society and how we understand any kind of demographic. And that's just because symbols and language are how we classify humans, right? And we classify humans based on these ideas of what that demographic looks like, right? Or dresses like, or how they're represented in the media, or how they're supposed to act, or how they're supposed to, or how the interactions are displayed, and or how actual interactions happen. And those all are in combination with our classification of that particular demographic, right? And media has a very big influence on this. And what is that? And so what does that say about aging? In this country, what that says is that we shifted, right? Where there used to be a lot less elderly people, becoming of old age was a really big deal. It meant that you had survived a lot. It meant that you had wisdom. It meant that you usually had a craft that you could hand down to other people and have apprentices to learn, right? It meant a wide variety of things. None of those were generally negative. And that's just because people didn't live long enough to really have a massive amount of those negative things. On top of that, they also there wasn't enough people aging that much in order for that to be a demographic that was like widely thought of, if that makes sense. But that changed, and that changed due to, again, medical interventions. Our um, life expectancy got significantly higher. And when that happened, that essentially allotted for this differential in thinking because it wasn't novel. It was no longer something to be revered. It was something that was just going to happen. And then it became, well, you're a drain on society because we're the ones working right now. We're paying for you. And then it became, as opposed to they had been working the whole time and now that's being repaid to them. It became a different dynamic. And a lot of that came down to how they were portrayed, how elderly persons were portrayed in the media, what it meant to get old, this massive association with becoming old and that being tied into self-worth in a negative way, that aging also taking away beauty, which becomes part of your self-worth, especially for women. It became this social dynamic of how many people over the age of 40 in women can you list that have leading roles in any media, television, movies, radio, et cetera, right? And these things become, after a certain point in age, you stop meeting that hypothetical beauty standard, and that then takes you out of representation. And once you've been taken out of representation, you become either invisible, you become the butt of the joke, or you become stereotyped in really negative ways. And that's really what happened. And those stereotypes have then bled over into our social interactions at a regular interpersonal level, in the same way that, I mean, even in our house, right? So my partner is 11 years older than me. I am 35, which is not that old. However, if you ask both of my children, we are old dust farts who do not know anything good, and our music is old, and the things we like are old, and we are just like, you know, really close to a nursing home at this point. We're just so old, right? And that's kind of the point, is that these perceptions of what old is, change as you get older, but also as a society, we've been taught that anything past the point in which you have hit reproductive age and started reproducing, you are old. You've officially done it. I say it all the time, man, I'm getting old. Like, and we say that, but like there's this negative connotation to it. And it becomes like this either joke, or it becomes a very serious things that lead to discrimination of those who are older, discrimination for being able to be leadership in certain things, to hold specific kinds of jobs, to get another job if you get laid off from a job you've had for a long time. And these things create this, well, you're losing your brain, you're losing your ability to function, you're, not going to be able to have the physical capacity you once was. And while that might be true, when you really look at the lifestyles of those 65 to 85 at this point in our lives, minus, disability due to some kind of thing that was already not present, or an accident or something, or military service, or you did a really physically demanding job that then had impacts on your body. Aside from those things, and the like um like illness and disease, right? Really, there's a maintaining a large amount of quality of life through those years. And because those years are now associated with this ability to have more freedom, a lot of time quality of life gets better. And that's because that work, sleep, wake up, work, sleep, wake up, work, sleep, wake up routine gets broken up. And that becomes that time where, oh, well, when I retire, I'll do that. I can't tell you how many times that is said in this household. Oh, I'll get to that when I retire. I'll travel when I retire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we say those things. But then when we get to that place, there's a lot of people actually making use of that time. And thus, some of those stereotypes are disconnected from the realities of what's happening in society. All right. So, fair warning, we're going to talk about suicide. So, if this is a point in which you need to step away, that's okay. We're going to talk about homelessness and living in the elderly after this. But if you don't catch that and you need to not the rest of this lecture, that's okay. All right. So we talk about suicide as a sociological perspective, from the sociological perspective, and that's talked about through multiple of our different theorists. Several worked on suicide, and then suicide was also mentioned in chapter 10 as well, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But I did pull the chapter 10 visual representation of just suicide by country, and that's rate per 100,000 people. And as you look, the United States is way behind on those numbers comparatively to a lot of other countries that come before it. And that's saying something. And what's that saying? And that's something that research has done, has been working on. Why are those rates so high in the US? And a lot of people are pointing to our media. A lot of people are pointing to, again, how we understand age or aging. A lot of people are tying that to mental illness. A lot of people are tying that in very different ways, right? And it kind of depends on which field you talk to. Is it medical field versus psychology versus sociology versus um, even anthropology, right? There's a massive difference in quality of life, in work life balance, in the amount of stuff we have to get done, the amount of um, those living under the poverty line. There's a significant amount of factors that factor into what is happening at a social level. Um, all right. And so there's also a cultural understanding of suicide. And your book gets into this a little bit. The difference between, say, maybe an honorable death in the military, should you be about to get captured or what have you, and you commit suicide before an enemy gets to you, or a cultural variation. I think that they did, don't want to get this wrong, so I'm not going to say, um, versus maybe, say, suicide of a young person. Or we just recently in the media, one that hit me hard um, was when the dancer Twitch um, died of suicide not that long ago and left behind his family, his kiddos, and was survived by them. And that was a big shock to a lot of people because he was always smiling. He was a big, big, big activist and just really big presence within the dance community. He was on Ellen, and he hosted for Ellen a lot whenever she would do little lapses where she wasn't there. Um, again, just an overall good spirited human. And that didn't change because of this, but it leaves those questions of why. And that's something that as a sociologist, we want to understand why this is happening. We want to understand why a phenomenon happens and from a social level. And as people close to the person, we also start asking questions of why and kind of search for the meaning that's behind why they made these choices. But it also comes with a personal amount of guilt or responsibility when it's somebody that you care about. Why is this happening? Like, why didn't I stop it? Could I have stopped it? What did we do wrong? What did we miss? Right. And I think that um, when somebody like Twitch, or I think the Anthony Bourdain was the one in the book, when these more big names, another one was Robin Williams, these conversations start and they start at a societal level, which at least adds to the conversation. Now, again, if this is something you are considering as you sit here and you are watching this video, there are resources for you. Please do not hesitate to reach out. There is the national hotline I can provide a direct number to. And there are many resources on campus as well, including the mental health facility, including that. And if you go in and tell them you are in crisis, they should be able to point you in the direction of a resource if they cannot help you at that point. Um, please seek out other people. There are people that care about you. But also as a society, we look at this and we understand death at a very interesting way, right? Societally, we look at death either through religion, we look at death either through, we code it through illness, or it was just your time, or we understand that aging happens, or sometimes illness happens, or an accident happens, or what have you. But we don't really have a way to code death or explain death at a societal level um, when it comes to suicide. And that's where those disconnects are, right? That's when you start asking those questions or not being able to understand or have a hard time processing those losses because those things are disjointed from how we've understood death as society or how we talk about death as society. And that and in some ways, these conversations surrounding these deaths of these people at a level of influence allows for these conversations to happen in ways to where maybe as a society we start figuring out how to code suicide or how to recode it as something that is not the fault of those left behind, or sometimes is not something that you can fix or that you can prevent. Um, and sometimes is not coded as mental illness, right? So often we attribute suicide to some kind of mental health ailment, right? So either depression or bipolar, schizophrenia, or several of these have manifestations where suicide is one of the symptoms of, say, of that mental health um, diagnosis. The problem with that becomes not all situations pan out that way, and not all suicides happen that way. And there are also social impacts. You see a lot of suicides in times of economic crisis. You see a lot of suicides in times of connected to maybe riskier behavior. You see a lot of suicides in times of, or in situations of um, big change. So, say maybe uh, like a big change in policy, maybe, or I'm thinking, um, and a good example of this is when you see a lot of anti-trans, say, related bills in the Senate, or you see a big Supreme Court win that makes that goes against a particular marginalized group. You see a lot of suicide within those populations due to this offset of a lack of feeling like they have a future, right? A lack of feeling their place in society. And that can have an impact that has nothing to do with mental illness and a lot to do with the social impacts, right? And so that's something I want you guys to think about, is how society and how sociology can then kind of look at suicide in different lenses and through different lenses. All right. Lastly, in this chat or in this chapter, we're going to talk about kind of homelessness and the elderly. Poverty in the elderly populations is declining. However, I'm going to make a big old caveat here. We talk about those under the poverty line. The poverty line is something you have to be severely impoverished to obtain. So while those in the severe poverty or underneath the poverty line is declining, and most of that has to do with Social Security, leaves you right there on that edge. Poverty itself, or those who are going to struggle to make rent, those who are going to struggle to buy groceries, especially as groceries start to get more expensive, right? Those who are going to struggle to be able to purchase the gas in order to get to and from the doctor, those kinds of things, those are still a very large problem. And even besides that, you have one, and I think it was 11 um, um, of those 65 plus who are in extreme poverty. That's still an extremely high number. 1 in 11, right? That's over 10%. That's way too high. On top of that, you add in those who then are in the next bracket of still um, lower class or still um, socially economically struggling, and that demographic is going to expand greatly. Okay. And so just thinking that through. You're also going to talk about debt and governmental policy impacting this. Okay. So when we talk about national debt, and they did that a little bit in the book in this chapter, and I'm not going to get into that because that could be its own lecture. And I don't think any of you want to sit through that one. The US spends more money than it brings in through taxes and outstanding bills it has to other countries and all of that jazz, right? It spends more money than that. And what has happened is there's a significant point where the US political members decided that in order to kind of figure out where to obtain that money, they essentially would put some of the money that's allotted from Social Security into essentially a particular kind of stock market specification to essentially try to make interest on that money, supposedly put it back, and then be able to have some kind of income coming in. The problem here is essentially that's the country gambling with the Social Security money in a very big way. And it hasn't always worked out well. And so that's something that moving forward, and even now, there's a large amount of political push to end that practice and or to really have conversations about the debt, about like that. That's almost always one of the talking points when it comes to big elections, or even especially the presidential elections, and how that's going to be remedied without increasing taxes significantly. And so that's something that as we look at, we need to look at the cost effectiveness of what our certain programs are, right? And when we talk about Social Security, so often I hear Social Security and all of the social policies being talked about as things that are very easy to cut at a human level, as opposed to talking about where major chunks of governmental money is spent. We can get into that. You want to have that conversation? We'll have it, but I'm not going to do it here. Okay. Point being that debt and governmental spending is going to have an impact on Social Security. It's going to have an impact on Medicaid, and all of those things have impacts on whether or not elderly persons have the economic stability they need to maintain housing, to maintain medications, to maintain health. And that leads to its own social problem, its own social crisis, right? Also, the cost of healthcare. We're going to get into this, and when we talk about it in chapter 10, the cost of healthcare is outrageous. Hands down, that is its own statement, right? The cost of healthcare in this country is by far the quickest thing to put someone into poverty than anything else, more than job loss, more than so many other things. And why that is because the way medical debt works is that it starts like it'll go into a debt collector. Those debt collectors can then start taking it out of paychecks, and it gets really ugly really fast. So it takes essentially one medical problem, one accident, one I tripped and fell and broke my leg, one car accident, one whatever, to essentially derail people for sometimes ever. And that's a really big deal. That's something that as a society, we're going to have to come up with solutions. And the solutions can't be ignoring the problem, because that's not working, because it is something that is consistently, again, as well as debt, you also have the cost of healthcare that is consistently talked about when we have any kind of political conversation surrounding candidates, surrounding political decision making. Also, those who are going to pull from Social Security is growing. The aging population is consistently growing, and it's not being replenished in the same way. So those who are going to go into a working demographic and pay into Social Security, at some point, that tipping scale is going to happen to where there are more people pulling from it than are working into it. And that's going to create a problem that is going to need to get dealt with as a society. And then again, all of the economic instability, the medical instability, all of these things create homelessness and elderly, which becomes a very big rising part of the homeless population, and also creates another social problem that needs to be dealt with a variety of different services, resources, etc. All right, and we can problem solve we're going to problem solve homelessness in another module, I believe. I think it's the family and housing or something. I don't remember exactly where it is, but we're going to talk about housing and housing instability in another chapter, and we'll make sure that we bring back up this topic so that we can have a conversation about really some of those resource driven ideas when it comes to how we address these topics. So I'm going to stop there for now. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about chapter 10. And then we're going to get into the Kafer book. So bear with me. as we continue to kind of work through Module Two's material. I hope you guys are having a good day and a good week, and I will talk to you again soon.
You should be very proud of me.
Cool.